Hi everybody, Citizenship Questions, lesson number 8. We'd like to thank the Rogers County Literacy Council, the Oklahoma Department of Libraries, and the Institute for Museum and Library Services that make these lessons available. Thank you very much. Today we're going to talk about more American history, and I'm going to really try to focus on the questions because some of these things are a little more foreign or things that maybe you haven't talked about with your kids or friends. So this is an important lesson. The first question is about the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were newspaper articles, essays, papers that were written by some of the founding fathers to convince people that they needed to ratify or vote for the new Constitution, the Constitution that we have now, that was ratified in 1787. So, as you can imagine, people were like, we're okay, we've won the Revolutionary War, Britain isn't our boss anymore. And the founding fathers said, yeah, but we need a group of laws. And of course, that's the Constitution. So some of the founding fathers wrote the Federalist Papers. And like I said, they were just an article that was published in newspapers in New York to convince people that the Constitution would be a good thing. And that's why I've drawn just a piece of paper. Remember, no television, email, Facebook, radio, none of those things were available. So the way to communicate to the people was through newspapers. So the Federalist Papers are papers. There are 85 of these articles written over a period of about a year. And they were put in the newspapers in New York so people could read them and find out more about the Constitution. So here's the question that's on your test. Who wrote the Federalist Papers? Who wrote those 85 papers? The answers are Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now you notice that I have one more thing written there. It's Publius. And you'll notice that I have a star by Publius and a star by Madison. Publius is a Latin word that means one of the public, one of the people. And sometimes Madison wrote his articles and just signed it Publius, so people who didn't care for his views would go ahead and read the article. You might know Hamilton from the very popular Broadway play where his life history is done in rap. And your kids probably know all the words to Hamilton. So, and then John Jay. So Madison, Hamilton, Jay. Madison, Hamilton, Jay. And you only have to answer one of those, just one of them. So whichever one is easiest to remember. Most of my students remember Hamilton because that's, something they've heard of lately, is that play Hamilton. And their kids know all the rap lyrics to all the songs. So, but you can answer Madison, Hamilton, or Jay. These are the people who wrote those Federalist Papers, trying to make sure that everybody would know about the new Constitution and would be for it. Okay, so the next question is, why was Benjamin Franklin famous? Okay, there he is right there. Most of our pictures of him look about like that. Of course, they're paintings and drawings. And Benjamin Franklin, as you can see, we think of him as kind of a chubby guy. He was one of the founding fathers. He was an inventor. He was a publisher. He had newspapers. And he did so many things. Most people recognize Benjamin Franklin's name because of his experiment with electricity, the kite and the key. But as far as, and that would be okay as an answer, but as far as our American history, Benjamin Franklin was very famous for several reasons. He was pretty old. He was almost 80 by the time of the Constitutional Convention. So he was the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention. And remember, the Constitutional Convention, one of the questions is, what did they do at the Constitutional Convention? Of course, they wrote the Constitution. So he was there when they were writing the Constitution. In fact, he was sick at the time, and they had to carry him in a specially made chair type of thing because he couldn't walk. Luckily, he lived in Philadelphia, so he lived in the town where they were having the Constitutional Convention. So he was the oldest person there. He was the first postmaster general. He thought of having post offices because, remember, only mail and newspapers back then were the communication, no telephones. And when he was a much younger man, he realized that he had to organize a way to get letters to people, documents to people. And so later he was the first postmaster general. He started free libraries. In these days, books were like a very expensive item that only rich people had. So he wanted people to have access to books, so he started free libraries. And he was a diplomat for the United States. He went to France and worked on treaties for the United States. He also wrote Poor Richard's Almanac. An almanac is a book about the weather, growing seasons, and so many things that people were interested in their life. A lot of people still read an almanac to learn when to plant their flowers or their crops. And he wrote Poor Richard's Almanac. So he was just famous for his experiments. He invented several things. The answer to this, whichever one's easiest for you to remember, is that he was one of the people at the Constitutional Convention. He was first postmaster general, started free libraries, wrote Poor Richard's Almanac, and a diplomat for the United States. Most of my students in the past have remembered that he was a diplomat, that he traveled to other countries on behalf of the United States to get help from those countries. So that might be the one you remember, but it could be any of these. The question is, what was Benjamin Franklin famous for? So any of those are correct. This is an easy one. I think everybody knows this one. Who was the father of our country? And of course that was George Washington. George Washington was the commander in general during the war that we had to get our freedom from Britain, from Great Britain, England. Then he was also the first president. So he's a pretty important figure in our American history. Some people say he was the most important figure in our history. So we call him the father of our country. and first president. So the questions are, who is the father of our country? George Washington. Who is the first president? George Washington. So there's two questions right there that you know. The next question is, what was the name of the purchase of a large piece of land in the United States? Let's see if you can see that. See the states. Now remember, the colonists were here, and all of this was wilderness and lived upon by the American Indians. So the French had claimed this part of the United States, of today's United States, and the United States bought that area of land from the French, and that's called the Louisiana Purchase. The question is, what is the area of land that the United States bought? And you can answer Louisiana or Louisiana Territory. And you'll notice, since I'm in Oklahoma, that Oklahoma is within the Louisiana Territory. We often don't think of that, but Oklahoma was purchased in this large purchase from France. And I think they got a bargain. So, okay, the next one is, name one war that was fought by the U.S. in the 1800s. Name one war the U.S. fought in the 1800s. So the 1800s be 1800 through 1899. Okay? So an easy one to remember is the War of 1812. Gives you the 18 right there, 1812. Another one was the Mexican-American War, which was fought during these years. Another one was the Spanish-American War, fought in 1898, right near the end of the 1800s. And the biggest war that we fought, and the one that there are several questions about, was the Civil War. The U.S. Civil War was fought between 1861 and 1865. It's very sad because it was the northern states against the southern states. So sometimes it was uncles fighting their nephews, brother against brother. And there were three issues, really. It was over the main one, and the one that everybody seems to remember the most, is slavery. The northern states wanted to get rid of slavery, and the southern states wanted to keep slavery because they were an agricultural farm part of the United States, and they needed the slaves to help them with their crops. So that tells you that it was also a money thing, an economic problem. The southern states made money by selling their crops, but they couldn't raise their crops without slaves. And then also it was a states' rights issue. The southern states said each state should have the right to do whatever it wants to. Right now, in this time frame, you can see that this is still always a question in the United States. Can the states do what they want to, even though their neighboring state is doing something different? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But slavery was the big issue. It's also called the war between the states and the war between the North and the South. And the question is, what is another name for the war between the North and South? So the answer would be Civil War or the war between the states. Either of those would be okay. This also fits into the question about what wars did the U.S. fight during the 1800s. So you could say the Civil War. So if you remember the Civil War, there's several questions about the Civil War, and that it was over slavery, and that it was fought during the 1800s. It was also called the War between the North and South. So the Civil War, it is a big part of our history, and an important part, and that's why there are several different questions about it. Next question is, what is one thing Lincoln did? Abraham Lincoln, here he is. And he was the 16th president. Now remember, George Washington was the first president. So some time has passed from 1787 clear up to 1860, 100 years about. And by that time, Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president. He's very, very famous in our history because he was the president during the Civil War. And remember, that's brother against brother, American against American fighting. It was a terrible, terrible time. So the question is, what was Abraham Lincoln famous for? He freed the slaves, and he was president during the Civil War. I mean, he was famous for a lot of things, but these are the two things that we remember. Freed the slaves, president during the Civil War. A lot of people say he saved the Union. It was because of Abraham Lincoln that the United States stayed together instead of becoming two separate countries, the North and the South. What is the Emancipation Proclamation? That's another question. Well, I'll give you a hint. Lincoln wrote it. Okay, and if you look at these words, emancipation means free or freedom. Proclamation means to proclaim, so to say, or to get to tell. So to tell, freedom, Emancipation Proclamation. It was the document, the paper that Lincoln wrote saying that the slaves were free. He freed the slaves. I think in Spanish, these two words, there are two words in Spanish very much like these two words. So Emancipation Proclamation, it proclaims, it tells of freedom. Lincoln wrote it, and it freed the slaves. So as you can imagine, that's a big deal. Don't forget Mr. Lincoln. This is a big deal. They go together. He wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. And last but not least, today, who's this lady? Okay. You notice we have very few ladies that we discuss in these history lessons. Remember, back in those days, the women were home taking care of the kids, taking care of the business, growing the crops, raising the animals, and taking care of slaves if they had slaves, and take care of the land, paying the bills, on and on and on and on. While the founding fathers were getting together and writing these documents and deciding on the government. This lady is Susan B. Anthony, and she is famous because she fought for women's rights. And she wasn't just fighting for women, but it turned out that women was the most important group. She was fighting for civil rights. In other words, rights for everyone. But at this time, women couldn't vote. And women had a very important part in asking questions about the government and how it was going to affect their families, but they didn't have the right to vote. So Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights. And that's it for today. We're just about finished now. We have 21 questions left. So we'll have two more of these and then a review session. And then I will tell you about a special deal we're going to have if everybody's watching these and for anybody who watches all 10. Thank you very much. See you next time.